Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second lesson in our Justice Unit and the second lesson on the topic of the Articles of Confederation. Today's essential question is, what were the challenges of the Articles of Confederation? That should be written across the top of your notes, and I will give you a moment to write that down. In our first lesson, we discussed what the Articles of Confederation were and what some of the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation were. Today, I am going to focus on some good things that happened while the Articles of Confederation were in force and some not so great things that happened while the Articles of Confederation were in force. The Articles of Confederation were the law of the land from 1776 until 1789, technically. During that time, the United States struggled to have effective central government because the Articles of Confederation didn't really set up an effective central government. So your left side question for this slide is, what occurred under the Articles? The good and the bad. So let's set this up as a T-chart. On the left side of your T-chart, you should have positive accomplishments. And on the right side of your T-chart, you should have, we'll call them challenges. Under positive accomplishments, one thing that they did actually manage to do when the Articles of Confederation were in force was come up with a system for creating new states. Remember, the 13 colonies became the 13 original states in the United States of America, and we now have 50 states, so there needed to be a system that allowed new states to become part of the country as we expanded westward. And so the states agreed that the territories, notice the vocabulary word, west of the mountains, or west of what used to be the proclamation line of 1763 during colonial times, would become new states. And this was important because many of the states that already existed wanted to extend their borders westward. And basically, under the Articles of Confederation, they agreed that no, the boundaries of the states would end at the Appalachian Mountains, and anything west of the Appalachian Mountains would be territory that would be used to create new states. So that was extremely important. They agreed that once a state had a minimum population of 60,000, which these days is not very much, but back then that was a significant number of people, they could write a constitution and they could apply to become a state. So they had to have 60,000 people, they had to write a constitution, and they had to then use that constitution as a basis to apply for statehood. They also made a very important decision, and this is actually a decision that affects you. They created a system that set aside land in each new township for public schools. So in the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains, they would basically divide areas of land into 36 sections, and one out of every 36 sections of land had to be set aside for schools. And this was important because it established the principle, notice the academic vocabulary words, it established the principle that education would be free and it would be public. So in other words, education would be something that as a country, we committed to educating people and setting aside land to build schools. That was important for democracy because having an educated population is extremely important if you're going to allow the people to decide who their leaders are and allow the people to make decisions about the future of the country. You want to make sure that people are well grounded and have a wide base of knowledge in math, science, civics, and critical thinking especially, because voting requires good critical thinking skills. So, under the Articles of Confederation, we came up with a system for creating new states, and we made the decision that we would have free public education. Those were two actual good things that occurred while the Articles of Confederation were in force. But then on the other side of that T-chart, we have those pesky challenges, and they were real and they were profound. There was a gentleman by the name of Daniel Shay. He fought in the Revolutionary War. He was not paid for fighting in the Revolutionary War. He was a farmer, and he had lots of debts that were owed in hard currency. And the problem was there was no hard currency in the United States under the Articles of Confederation, so he literally had no way to pay his debts, and he was in danger of going bankrupt. He was one of many farmers who found themselves in that same position, and they decided to organize a revolt that challenged the power of the government to make them go bankrupt as a result of their debt. So they basically started shutting down courthouses so that the courthouses and the judges basically couldn't declare them bankrupt and allow the banks to come and take their property away. So kind of like the Declaration of Independence says, if the government is not meeting your needs, you have a right to change the government. Daniel Shay was living up to that. He organized marchers who were also farmers, who were also in danger of losing their farms, many of whom also fought in the Revolutionary War, to seize weapons from a federal arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts. Notice the vocabulary word, by the way. To use in the revolt. So this was a very organized revolt against the government. It was mostly against the government of Massachusetts, but it was also a direct challenge to what national government there was, and it was a direct challenge to the system to the extent that there was one that existed at the time. There was no national army, so when Massachusetts called up Congress, because remember there was no president, they called up Congress and said, hey, we need help. Congress said, well, what do you want us to do about it? We don't have an army. There's not much we can do. And so Massachusetts was actually forced to use local militias that actually had nothing to do with the government to put down the protesters and to put down this revolt. And it basically showed that when the federal government, to the extent that there was one, was called upon, that it was completely ineffective, it had no teeth, and it could not rise to the challenge when it was confronted with a crisis. And as a result of that, the positive thing is 12 of the 13 states realized the Articles of Confederation are not working. We need to do something different. And as a result, we should have a convention where we revise and change the Articles of Confederation. Realizing, of course, that it took 13 out of 13 states to change the Articles, they at least committed to having a meeting where they would talk about it. Now, there were actually two meetings. The first meeting was called the Annapolis Convention. It really didn't accomplish much, but it basically was an opportunity for them to decide, you know what, we need to have a second meeting. And that second meeting was called in Philadelphia in 1787, and it was called the Constitutional Convention. And so your next left side question is going to be, why was a constitutional convention called? Now, I've already pretty much told you that, but there it is as a left side question. Take a moment to write that down, and let's just get into it. After Shay's rebellion, the states really realized that America needed a stronger government. It was obvious that the central government really didn't have any teeth. It was completely ineffective, and it could not meet the needs of the day. And so 12 of the 13 states sent delegates to Philadelphia in May of 1787, and their mission was to revise and improve the Articles. Please focus on those underlined words, revise and improve. Their job was not to write a new constitution. So obviously something happened. And Rhode Island, being a small state, really liked the fact that it had as much power as the big states. So Rhode Island really did not have much interest in changing the articles. The other 12 states at least acknowledged that this was something we needed to talk about. So there it is. Rhode Island did not send delegates because Rhode Island was happy not having a federal government that could tell it what to do. But the delegates who did show up to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia decided we're going to elect George Washington as our leader. They needed someone who was objective. They needed someone who was non-biased. They needed someone who was trustworthy. And George Washington, as the hero of the Revolutionary War, was all of those things. In many ways, he was the father of the nation, and he was trusted to be fair, to listen to all perspectives, and to not push things one way or the other based on his own opinions. So he was a good choice for president of the convention. And so over the next few lessons, we are going to talk about the decisions that they made at the convention that led to the writing of a brand new constitution that created the government that we had today. But this is kind of you're setting the table for that. So more is coming, but for today, that's what we're going to do. So as always, at the end of any lesson, I'm now going to ask you to write a summary, taking the time to write about 5 sentences emphasizing the most important things you learned in this lesson. And as always, I will sign off once again on the Waldo Middle School Social Studies YouTube network.